we might find merit to a family, conception of justice rooted in the family, is the emphasis on the development of a moral psychology of justice. And if we think about the family as a place where justice, sense of justice is developed, it helps us to think about the education and how practices, for example, around the dinner table, may have a great deal in the development of our conceptions of justice, and more so than we traditionally thought. Right? So Confucianism brings our attention to a ground crucial to the development of basic conceptions of moral psychology. In addition, attention to matters of ritual, role, and performance in the practice of justice, that notion of rights in Confucianism, allows us to acknowledge those times when justice does require us to act in ways that are very specific to the person and to the situation, and when generalized procedures may be circumvented. So there's in part more attention to effective feeling, much more to this virtue as humaneness than in the impartiality model. So we find in Confucianism then greater attention to the particular qualities and circumstances of the other. So at 11:20, and I'll read the quote, Dong Shi Hua said, Zhu asked whether, if one hears something, one practices it, and you, master, said that his father and elder brothers were still alive. But when Ran Yu asked the same question, you, master, said that when one hears something, one should practice it. So basically, what's happening in this quote is that Confucius is giving different answers to different students. And so this person is saying, why are you telling one person one thing and then another person another thing? And so the answer for Confucius is, Q is backward, and so I urged him on, but you is an over-enthusiastic person, so I held him back, right? So the idea is that here we have this notion that different solutions may be required for different types of individuals. Also, the model of the family is basic to moral motivation, and Confucianism asserts the idea of interdependency among human beings and avoids what sometimes people feel as the over-individualistic presumptions of the community. So the household and the family, that the Confucians are political in the sense that they're the first arena for the practice and demonstration of public virtues. But of course, it's one in which assumes natural hierarchies and ideals of reverence and respect. So, of course, this would be seen as a fallacy in the Aristotelian perspective, right? By bringing those notions of hierarchy and differentiation of the household realm into the political realm would be a violation of politics, right? In that Aristotelian view, but for Confucius, that continuity is seen as appropriate. So who is the good political actor in Confucianism? Again, the idea of the gentleman, Su. In most of the analects, Confucius settles for a more, rather than the sage, right, as we went through last time, settles for the better man. And an interesting commentary by a well-known scholar of Confucianism in China, in particular, Theodore William Barry, suggests that by the invocation of this term, gentleman, which I agree, that Confucius is replacing what was initially a term of basic socioeconomic distinction, right, a term of aristocracy, with the notion of nobility that's no longer associated with position, but with virtue, so that Confucius acknowledges this gentleman or nobleman who now does not need to hold an office to be noble. So Confucius in some ways is changing the meaning of the term, traditionally meant to refer to a class with clear influence, and changing this to mean or to refer to possibly isolated individuals in society who have a certain sensitivity as to their role to serve as a model and to cultivate the virtues, or taking nobility, you might say, out of the hands of the state and putting it into the hands of the morally righteous. Barry summarizes this sort of linguistic move by Confucius as taking the term gentleman from the high-born and applying it to the high-minded. So along these lines, the opening passage of the Analects notes that nobility should be considered separate from social and political recognition. So as we see in 4:14, the master said, one is not worried about not holding position. One is worried about how one may fit oneself more company. One is not worried that nobody knows one. One seeks to become fit to be known. So what is the behavior of the good person beyond the confines of a family? What is considered to be good service? What does a good citizen do? Well, again, we can go through and see various ways in which this is indicated by example in the text. So acting in exemplary ways, being aware of one's public presence and the effects of one's actions. So as we see in 1610, Master Kong said there are 9 things the gentleman concentrates on. In seeing, he concentrates on clarity. In listening, he concentrates on acuteness. In expression, he concentrates on warmness. In demeanor, he concentrates on courtesy. In words, he concentrates on loyalty. In deeds, he concentrates on reverence. When he is in doubt, he concentrates on asking questions. When he is indignant, he concentrates on the problems. And when he sees opportunity for gain, he concentrates on what is right. So again, as I also indicated last time, right, instead of a sort of like what does the Platonic individual or just individual concentrate on, right? They concentrate on the parts of the soul, right? Being in alliance and being in harmony. So for Plato, even despite the metaphysical grounding of his thought to some degree, it's a question of internal harmony. Whereas, right here, the gentleman is concentrating on clarity. So the gentleman has to be aware not only of what they are saying, but how those words are being interpreted, and acknowledging that the delivery of those words has to be done in a way such that others can understand them well. So there is really this much greater sense of outward sensitivity and sensibility in this Confucian notion of gentlemanliness, right? Concentrating on courtesy and demeanor. Again, you might call it empathy or some other quality, but it's an idea that you have to somehow be plugged in, right? Or trying to be much more plugged in into how your actions are being played out in the minds and thoughts of people around you. He suggests that exemplary behavior will in many instances replace the need for violence. He says at 12:19, suppose I were to kill those who lack the way in order to advance those who have the way. How would that be? Master Kong replied, you are running the government, so what is the point of killing? If you desire good, the people will be good. The nature of the gentleman is as the wind, and the nature of the small man is as the grass. When the wind blows over the grass, it always bends. Now we're going to come back to that quote a bit more when we talk about governments. To taking duties seriously, 1538, the master said to serving one's ruler, one deals reverently with the tasks involved and makes the livelihood involved a secondary consideration. Again, in 1319, he refers to reverence in handling business. Thirdly, attention to language. Again, this interesting idea invoked in Confucianism called the rectification of names. The person who acts as an example will use language and names in their proper application. It will encourage a proper perspective in others, a sort of concern for analytical clarity that is, I guess, in some ways paralleling that of Socrates and Plato. And he develops this at 13.3. He says, Zilu said, if the Lord of Wei were waiting for you to run the government, what would you give priority to? The master said, what is necessary is to rectify names, is it not? Zulu said, if this were to take place, it would surely be an aberration of yours. Why should they be rectified? The master said, how uncivilized you are. With regard to what he does not understand, the gentleman is surely sometimes reluctant to offer an opinion. If names are not rectified, then words are not appropriate. If words are not appropriate, then deeds are not accomplished. If deeds are not accomplished, then the rights of music do not flourish. If the rights of music do not flourish, then punishments do not hit the mark. If punishments do not hit the mark, then the people have nowhere to add their foot. So, when a gentleman names something, the name can definitely be used in speech, and when he says something, it can definitely be put into practice. In his utterances, the gentleman is definitely not casual about anything. So what does this mean? And it's in some ways, in many ways, a curious quote, and I certainly don't claim to understand all that it's saying. Although I have a certain intuition, right? And that this is the idea that what happens in a lot of public life is a question of putting the right label, or putting labels to certain things. There's a politics of how we frame certain things and how we call certain things. I mean, a classic example of this, right, is in terms of the current Senate scandal and so on, and the whole PMO crisis and knowledge and rights. So, on the one hand, right, you have someone who worked at the law court within the House who might say that the interference of the PMO in the Senate and even the attempt to sort of get senators to change the auditor's report on McDuffie, all that is just part of standard operating procedure in Ottawa. But that's just how the PMO works with other politicians on the Hill. But there's sort of a give and take, that things are changed, and that's just part of the political pressures and give and take that goes on the Hill. And then you have, right, someone else looking at that same situation and saying, well, no, right, the RCMP officer, that's fraud, right, that's bribery, that's a crime, right? And so there's a sort of political tussle, right, is the degree to which we call those actions standard operating procedure, or whether it falls outside the line of appropriate behavior in that circumstances, and we call it a crime. And so, I mean, what I think Confucius is getting at here is that there's an appropriate way to frame things, and then inappropriate ways to frame things. And so that the person, the cultivated individual, will call things as they are, right? And will not engage in sort of a political rhetoric that seeks to put fine descriptions around things, right? It's the type of fine descriptions and re-descriptions of creative language that we'll find in books 14 to 18 of Machiavelli's Prince after the break, right? Where he talks about ways in which we can redefine generosity and redefine honesty and so on. So the idea is that the upright individual will call things as they are, and if one gets the danger, I think, for Confucius, if one acknowledges the slipperiness of language, then you get into a situation where questions of justice and injustice no longer are clear. And so you begin to break down if language is no longer clear, if how you frame things in politics and public matters no longer becomes clear, then the distinctions between right and wrong that tend to be foundational for social political order, all those things begin to unravel. So there's essential importance to language in keeping political community orderly and in harmony. And a funny sort of perverse way, as we'll find next term, Hobbes believed the exact same thing. The only difference is that Hobbes himself, in the beginning of Leviathan, will tell us what all these words mean, and that's what we accept as a way to lead us into his general defense of his own vision of government. But similarly, right, for Hobbes, the idea that language disputes can be the source of political disputes and ultimately the source of political disorder, and therefore, if you're going to make for an ordered society, you have to ensure that the meaning of terms be used in a sort of solidified and common way. So this is an interesting reflection there that goes beyond Confucius about the importance of clarity and analytic precision in language and its political importance or significance. Another point in Confucius about acting as a good citizen is the question of distributive justice, right? He talks at section 4, I've heard that the gentleman helps those who are in straitened circumstances and does not maintain the wealthy. So there is some acknowledgement of distribution. And then a question is the degree to which the person with some eye to the public life will seek active reform. I have a question mark because we really can think of the example of Confucius himself, and he himself withdrew from government when things got difficult, although he engaged in sort of an alternative public life. He didn't obviously take the reins of government or involve himself as a minister in government anymore. But he did go around seeking places where he could have some influence, and it wasn't that he retreated completely to a private life. So some ways he did seek to educate and I guess help to percolate ideas of change, potential change. So what are the limits of citizenship then? Well, Confucius tells us that there'll be certain circumstances when public involvement may need to be cut back. So he tells us in 8:13, one does not enter a state which is in peril, nor reside in one which is rebellious. When the way prevails in the world, then be seen; when it does not, then hide. When the way prevails in your own state, to be made poor and obscure by it is a disgrace. But when the way does not prevail in your own state, to be made rich and honorable by it is a disgrace. So again, depending on the climate of your community, you may dictate the type of political and public actions you're involved with. Secondly, in terms of limits of citizenship, he suggests that one should perform the task one has been assigned to do and nothing more. And he says at 8:14, if one is not in a certain office, one does not plan the governance involved in that office. Another limit is this sense of certain detachment, I think, that comes out of the quote at 4:11. So he tells us that while the small man, right, cherishes the soil, which one might think is a sort of definition of patriotism, right, where a small man cherishes the soil, the gentleman cherishes virtue. And again, the small man cherishing leniency, the gentleman cherishing the rigors of the law. So devotion to principles of good public practice. And fourthly, at times the goals of the gentleman and those of the state will come into conflict. And in that, and when it's not possible to seek a life elsewhere, in that instance, sacrifice may be may be required. So as he tells us at 15:9, the determined public servant and the humane man never seek to preserve life in such a way as to injure humaneness, but they will sometimes even sacrifice their lives in order to achieve humaneness. So there are circumstances when self-sacrifice will be required. Sacrifice for the good construed as a higher order of public service. One could perhaps talk about, the comparison with Socrates and so on, but maybe some of those suggestions are too esoteric. Let's look at the nature of governments for Confucius. Or here, actually, we're at the hour, so why don't we take a 10-minute break and then come back to that after the break.